Hello? Okay. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to another session of the Emergency Medicine Interest Group. Today we have Brenda Nelson, Chief Flight Nurse for the Airlift Northwest program, here to give us about an hour-long talk, and I think you're willing to have questions throughout, or you want to save them till the end? Okay, questions throughout.
Yep.
And I don't think Airlift Northwest needs much of introduction, so I'll just let Brenda get on with it.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. A little bit about myself. I've been a nurse since 1986. I started out in Montana, which I consider close to wilderness medicine after I moved here. And in my first 3 years of nursing, I did neonatal ICU, emergency department, ground and fixed wing ambulance transport. So I tried to cram a lot into 3 years. And once I figured out I could leave the hospital and do other things, that was my career path. So I have been at Airlift Northwest for 20 years now, just celebrated 20 years. Airlift has been in business since 1982, and so I'll give you a little bit of the story of Airlift Northwest, but first what I wanted to do is talk about what all started air medicine, and as you can probably guess, the same as medical, military events happened, and so it was interesting looking through the history of things, and I know some of it, but this was new to me. So the first documented air ambulance occurred during the siege of Paris, and they evacuated their soldiers by air balloons. So probably not the most efficient way to move people, but that was pre-airplanes. And then the first true air ambulance was during World War I, or the Great War as it's known, and they actually landed on the battlefield, weirdly enough, and picked up a prisoner of war, and the French moved him to a hospital there. And so what they started seeing when they started moving people is an increased survival. And once they started seeing medevacs by Hilo in World War II, and these are really small aircraft that patients are on the outside of it, they saw a 60% improvement in their mortality rate, just because they're moving the patients out of the field into the hospitals where they could get care. And of course, care is improving the whole time thanks to wars, because we've learned more and more how to take care of things. And unfortunately, that's a hard way to learn how to take care of people and how to save people's lives, but it certainly has helped. So Schaefer Air is out of California, and that's the first FAA certified air ambulance. And the reason that's important is the FAA controls a lot of what we do. And throughout this talk, you'll hear about how we have to follow certain rules, how there's legislation right now. The Airline Deregulation Act that occurred in 1972 has affected air ambulance. And so that's important because they oversee everything that we do. And finally, we saw the first dedicated use of helicopters by U.S. forces in the Korean War. And as we all have probably seen the movie MASH, it is the hallmark movie for air medical transport teams. We play it every year at our annual conference. They really were the groundbreakers. And not only did they bring patients in from the field to stabilize them at the MASH units, but once those patients were stabilized, they actually flew some of those patients to Navy ships so they could be moved on. So we saw a lot of growth in the Vietnam War, and I think part of that was the Hueys came in, and they were big aircraft that you could put lots of people on. And a novelty idea was they trained medics, which was the first time that somebody other than a physician was able to take care of a patient. And they really started looking at what they had to do as far as, do they start lines, do they put chest tubes in, do they give fluids in the field, and all of that improved the survival rate. So we saw a pretty drastic change in the mortality rate, down to 1 out of 100 soldiers died because of this change in practice. So in 1958, the first civilian helicopter was put into place in California, and that was put in place by a physician that wanted to get his patients to him, and then they also used it to move medicine during emergencies. So that was interesting. And then in '69, they took all those lessons they learned from Vietnam, because they saw that the soldiers in Vietnam were surviving more than the civilians on California highways when they crashed. So they said, that's not right, let's bring that information here. And they had 2 programs that were started to do that. And one of them was called Project CareSum, and that was down in Mississippi. And they actually got federal grants to buy helicopters. They placed them strategically in Mississippi. and they found an improvement in their outcomes for all their patients. Now, interestingly enough, only one community chose to keep their helicopter, and that was Hattiesburg, and it's still a program that runs today. And the other two didn't, and they probably couldn't take the cost on. And then MAST, which was throughout the U.S., but started at Fort Sam Houston in Texas because they saw similar things. And what the goal of MAST was to enhance the civilian care of patients and moving them where they needed to go. And so you saw a lot of those military medics and the helicopters coming in. And up until about 20 years ago, they were doing it around here, and they would go out to islands where they didn't have any services, and they would move those patients into Seattle or Tacoma to get care until Airlift came around, and then we said we'll take over from that. And it was a little bit of a tussle, but we finally got that. And then finally, Maryland State Police was really kind of a big program, and they are still a big program, actually. They have medics on board, but they are also police officers, so they do a dual purpose. Their first is medical care and moving patients from the highways that are in accidents, but then they also are involved in law enforcement and traffic control if they have to. So they have some marvelous new helicopters, which I saw when I toured the Augusta factory not too long ago. They can put 2 patients in there and walk around their helicopter. That's how big it is. So as you can see, there's been a lot going on in the U.S. There was a fair number of programs dotted around in the populated areas, but nothing here until about 1982. And so Airlift started then, and Dr. Kopis is the brains behind it all. And you may know him for his participation in developing the Medic One program with Dr. Cobb. He was a medical director everywhere, I think, in Southeast Alaska, here in Washington. He felt it was important to share his knowledge, and he was a military doc also. And he was called to a conference in Sitka, and they had a house fire up there. And they had kids that got burned in the house fire. They've asked for his help. He did everything he could for about 5 days to get these kids down to Seattle to the burn center, and not one of them survived long enough to get down here because there was no flight teams either in Alaska or Washington to move these children. So he vowed that that would never happen again to him. So he got a group of people together, and we had a consortium of hospitals originally that developed this. And they all agreed to go in and put some money towards it and support the training and fund the cost, essentially. For years, we just said, here's our bill, and they paid it, which was really fabulous, but it's not the way of the world anymore. But he developed this as a fixed-wing only program. They got into a little Citation jet that took about 3.5 hours to get to Alaska. They flew that thing back and forth for years. And he is, I don't know if you guys know him, but he was an old farmer. And so if there wasn't a demand, he didn't do it. So we grew organically, that as there was demand, we increased our program. So weirdly enough, when we first started helicopters here, the Bainbridge medics would wait for us for 30 minutes because we could come in from home and get on the helicopter and fly 6 minutes across the water and pick up the patient. Not anymore. So we've gradually added helicopters around Western Washington. So we essentially are along the I-5 corridor, and that is from Bellingham, Arlington, Seattle, and Olympia, and we just opened a helicopter in Yakima yesterday to meet the need of Central Washington. So we grow as we need to, and we address the needs of what the patients are demanding by putting the aircraft where we need it. So staffing of Airlift has always been 2 nurses, and Dr. Kopis did that because we were primarily an inter-facility team. And that's not the usual staffing model you get for air medical transport these days. It's usually nurse medic or nurse RT, depending on if it's a team that comes out of a specialty hospital. We are all EMTs, which that's a whole different story. So we have some baseline field training, but our expertise is critical care, and so that's what we really focus on. We have 1 pediatric specialist, we call them. They can have a neonatal or a pediatric ICU background, and 1 adult specialist, and they have from any variety of backgrounds, ED, cardiac, neuro, trauma, burn. We have all of them have come in. Once they get to us, we very quickly turn them into generalists because we do everything. So we do a lot of education, lots of training to get them going that way, but they come in with their specialties. Training and medical control sit with UW Medicine. That means we access the sim labs. We go to the classes that they offer. We used to take ATLS with the doctors. They've now made a nurse version of that, ATCN. We have all our ALS courses. We do 3 weeks of core training before we even let people consider getting onto an aircraft. They go to the OR at Harborview and practice using our glide scope and getting good at that. On average, when people leave our core training, they've had between 30 and 40 intubations, because what we find is we go out there and people have tried to intubate patients, and we walk in, they're like, oh, thank God, can we have your glide scope? And we don't know if they're trained on it, but we'll say, well, we're happy to intubate the patient for you, and we invite them to participate with it. But after multiple intubation attempts, you can only imagine what those airways look like. Hamburger is one description that's often heard. So we bring a skill level that not every nurse in a hospital has, because we come in and we're really kind of seen as the rescue group. Sometimes it's a little bit challenging to be labeled as that, but so anyway, what we say is we bring UW medicine to the bedside. All our policies and procedures are vetted through UW medicine and Seattle Children's, and we are a critical care unit in the air. So one call to our dispatch center and we get things rolling. All right, here's our service areas. Again, I mentioned where our helicopters are. We actually have 2 planes that sit up in Juneau, Alaska, and that's a direct reflection on how this program started. Southeast Alaska is landlocked, and so you either get in and out of there by boat or air. There's no driving anywhere, so it's a little bit entertaining when you go up to Juneau, Alaska, and you say, I can do the roads in 40 minutes, and that's all of them. Or Ketchikan has about 20 miles worth of roads. So they are limited on what they can do, and they're very small communities. Even though Juneau is the capital of Alaska, it's tiny. They don't have a cardiac unit. They don't have cath lab. They have a CT, but surgically they have a general surgeon, so they move a lot of stuff out of there. Okay, here's our aircraft, and there's tons of aircraft out there for people to choose from. This is what Airlift has decided suits them. The Lear, which is the big jet, flies at about 500 miles an hour, has a range of 1,200 miles before it has to stop. We do use that for all our long distance flights. And we're not limited to 1,200 miles, it just means we have to land somewhere and get more fuel. So I currently, unfortunately, am a little bit of a black cloud, but hold the record for longest flight, and that's to Nova Scotia and then to Mazatlan. So a long flight. We have been asked to go to Hawaii. The Lear cannot make it to Hawaii. It's a little bit short on fuel for that. Then the other 2 aircraft you see there, the Turbo Commander is an aircraft that could land on dirt runways if it had to. We don't generally do that. It's a little bit slower at about 325 miles an hour and has about an 800-mile range, unless it has a good tailwind, and then it will go a little bit farther. Very compact in there. And it has some weight limitations to it. So we really brought that in to do the small runways. And let me go back to this map. In Southeast Alaska, Cake, Hoonah, Skagway, Klawock, all of those require a smaller aircraft. And guess what? That's where all the cruise ships stop when they have a patient that's sick. So before we had that aircraft up there, we used to have to ask Coast Guard to evacuate our patients off the ship for us. So it makes sense to get something that goes into those smaller communities. And they're only daytime runways too, so you can't go in at night. They don't have any lights. And in the winter, you have to make sure that there's no bears, moose, and snow on the runway before you go in. So somebody is out there clearing them all away. So the Pilatus, which is a brand new aircraft for us, it had all of about 10 hours of flight time on it when we brought it, custom interior for that. We brought that into Yakima to really meet the needs of the Central Washington group over there. It has a similar speed as the Turbo Commander, but the Turbo Commander is an aircraft that's no longer built. In fact, the last one was built about 20 years ago. So it's an aging aircraft, an aging airframe, and so that requires more maintenance. So it's time to start looking for different aircraft. So this one is a departure from what Airlift has done, and we were always a dual engine company. This has such an amazing safety record to it. That we felt like it was good to go, and it's got all the bells and whistles on it, and the pilots who said, no, I'm never going to fly a single engine aircraft, love it. So it was a good choice. But it's also, the other thing that we are faced with are wider and bigger patients. And it's not, you can't really see it in this picture, but it's got a cargo door on it and a hydraulic lift. So before we were limited to patients 28 inches wide and about 300 pounds, the limitation is still width because of the size of the tube, essentially the size of the interior of the aircraft, because you have to be able to take care of them and you have to kind of be able to move past them. But it's about 32 inches now and it's 450 pounds. So the hydraulic lift does all of it. So no back injuries, no shoulders, no anything like that for moving the patients in. So challenges for everybody as our population gets bigger. All right, here's our Rotary Wing aircraft. We have two different kinds, actually, and it served us well. So when Airlift started their Rotary program, they were all an Augusta fleet. And it was an older aircraft called the Mark II, but it was a fast aircraft. It averaged about 160 miles an hour. So, and it was smooth, which is an important thing for a patient, right? If you have fractures or injuries, you want to have a smooth ride, which an ambulance will never give you that. As we started replacing our aircraft, we moved to the Augusta Power, and that's the one Airlift owns. We love that. We call her the queen of the fleet. She's compact, but she's fast, and she's smoother than the EC-135. And the only reason I put Airbus up there is because Airbus bought them. But they're a Eurocopter. They're a backloading aircraft. They fly at about 135 miles an hour, and they're a little bit rougher ride, just the way they've been designed. Essentially, their compartments are same size, but they work a little bit differently in the back. But here's the limitations, and we'll talk more about this. There's no CPR done on patients in an aircraft that's effective. I can't tell you how creative I've become, and I'm so glad when firemen have said, oh, I think all her ribs are broken, because that means I can compress her chest with one hand or one elbow, depending on where I'm sitting. But we're not giving good chest compressions in an aircraft. So that's kind of the challenges of being in a helicopter, especially. We can do a little bit more in the planes. Yeah. So we are looking at the Lucas device, but it won't fit in the EC. Once it's on the patient, it won't fit through the tunnel that we have to slide the patient through. So that's one of our challenges. So right now we hold the record for longest CPR in the field with a good outcome. It was an 18-year-old that went down on Mount Rainier. And between his friends, the EMS people we managed to help get up there, and our nurses, 86 minutes of CPR. And that guy walked out of the hospital about a week later. It was crazy. But he wouldn't have survived if we'd put him in the helicopter, because you just don't get good flow. Now, the one thing that we've done that's been successful is pace them. So if you have a young heart and they don't have anything else going on, then sometimes you can pace them instead of doing chest compressions and get a pulse. It's all about getting the pulse. So I did that from Ketchikan with a young lady that had been in an accident, and okay, it was desperate, but I can't do CPR for an hour and 45 minutes, and that's what my flight time is from Alaska. My partner and I just looked at each other and said, we can't do it. So we said, well, let's pace her and see if we can get her down there alive, and it worked. So unfortunately, she died from her injuries about 2 days later. But you have to be creative when you're in a helicopter or a plane. So we are looking at Lucas devices for the long distance stuff, but not for helicopters. All right, so let's talk about our nurses. We like to say they're the cream of the crop. We don't have any problem recruiting our nurses. At a minimum, they have 5 years of ICU experience. We used to say ICU or ED, but what we're finding is the patients are getting so much sicker that they really need the ICU experience for the hemodynamics and monitoring their respiratory and managing that. They are required to get a certification in their area of specialty, and for nurses, that's like a CCRN, a certification in emergency nursing, and there's a couple of, there's a certified flight nurse. So that really just says they've spent the time to get to know their specialty, and they've proven it a knowledge base essentially by a test. And what you'll hear from any nurse that's taken it is they will never take that test again, but they will maintain it by continuing ed. They're tough tests, and you have to really work hard to get them. Then, of course, you need a Washington license, and for those in Alaska, they have to carry 2 licenses, a Washington and Alaska license. And the reason for that is we work under the medical director's license. So since since we're based in Washington, they need a Washington license too. So our medical director has licenses in Alaska and Washington also. So when we start training our nurses, so first I'll talk about the interview because it's intimidating for people. We put a panel interview together, and it's an educator, me, one of my assistant chiefs, and somebody, and the medical director is involved with every interview. These are behavior-based questions. We grill them on, tell us about a time you made an accident, or you made a mistake, and what did you do about it? And if they say, oh, I've never made a mistake, you know that's not true to start with, but you know, you want them to recognize that mistakes happen, and you have to own up to them. And what are you going to do to fix it? You know, so we need people to recognize that and to have that self-awareness. The other huge thing that we talk about is how do you interact with people under stress? Because we're walking into hospitals that have limited resources. They've done everything they can for this patient, and they've called us to move the patient because they have to be moved. And they're either stressed out because they know they can't do anything else for it, or sometimes they feel like the care wasn't the best that they could give, and they're bummed out about that. And on top of that, they have a family who's now having the worst day of their life. So we really want nurses that can go in and say, well, you've done a great job. You know, is there anything you can do to help us get him ready to go? Give me a report. Let's work together as a team. And then to reassure the family, we're going to take really good care of your loved one. We'll do everything possible. We're very honest about getting them to the hospital alive or not. And so they need to know. And most recently, we've added that a family member can ride in a helicopter, which was unheard of for us. So because we put them up next to the pilot, and there's all those controls and things up there. So we need to know that they're going to be calm enough to sit in the front seat of a helicopter. So, and we isolate them, because if the patient's really sick, the nurses in the back need to talk, and they don't want to have the family member listening in. So the pilot will say, do you want me to isolate you? We're like, yes. So, but we do keep them up to training. So once they get through the whole interview process and they have a written test, they do a simulation, and they do a panel interview. And then their references are checked, of course. So, and that's very limiting what you can ask, just so you know. My favorite question is, would you hire them again? And if they hesitate, then you want to know why. So, but other than that, the people are limited on what you can say about employees. Same with UW. So just remember that if you're looking for information. So initially, we put them into 3 weeks of lecture. We used to call it Death by PowerPoint. We now do a flipped classroom model, which means we give them some homework to do to prep for the next day. But we're really aiming to get them a baseline knowledge of everything that we see. And so our specialties are sepsis. We see a ton of neck fash, more than anybody else in the country. We see a lot of really sick neonates. And we do a ton of pediatric special needs kids. And so if you think about what those kids are, they're respiratory, they're sepsis, and they're metabolic derangements. So they really are challenging. So we need people that have a baseline of kind of what all of this is. And then the cardiac kids are a whole another challenge. So after they get through 3 weeks of this training, and they get hands-on training, they get sim time, they get to learn our equipment, we pair them with 2 preceptors. So they fly as a third nurse. And sometimes it's all they can do to put their seatbelt on in the aircraft. So we've taken these very experienced nurses and put them in this really strange environment and expect them to function. So the first 2 or 3 times they're out on a flight, all we want is get in the aircraft, put your seatbelt on, get your helmet on, and go through your checklist. You don't need to take care of the patient. You get to just watch. And then once they're a little more used to being in an aircraft, because it's noisy, it's full of vibrations, you could be gone for hours. Oh, and you don't get to pee until you land. So don't drink a lot of water. And so then, you know, so that's all things they have to learn. And that's just completely outside of what they have to do for nursing care. So it's a bit of a challenge. So we give them a long orientation. So once they get through orientation, we tell them we don't expect them to be very comfortable in flight nursing for a year. So nobody's jumping in and saying they know this job. Then we go through ongoing training, and this is a picture of a team doing a simulation of a trauma. And they've probably had to put the patient in a C-collar, they probably had to intubate, and now they're running a code based on what we've given them as symptoms. And there's actually competitions for this. So we have teams that go and compete at our big national conferences to do this, and it's amazing what they come up with. So we do a lot of that, and I think you guys will probably see more and more of it throughout your training, is a lot of simulation, because there's something, you can't practice on the patients, or people aren't as likely to say, here, practice this IV on my hand. So that's the only way you're going to get it, right? We do a airway lab, which we don't talk about much because the PETA people like to protest outside of it if they know about it. But we do need to learn how to do surgical airways. And that's a last-ditch effort, but we use pigs for those. And these pigs are well anesthetized and sedated, but they're alive while we're doing this, because you need the feel of what it's really like to cut through somebody's neck before you have to go out and do it. So once we've done the glide scope as a tool, and that's video laryngoscopy, we have done no surgical airways, knock on wood, because I've done 3 of them, and I don't ever want to do them again. I don't think there's anything scarier than cutting through somebody's neck while they're breathing. But, for facial trauma or whatever, we couldn't intubate. So I think the most horrendous one was a guy that was racing. He head-on crashed with somebody, had bilateral humeral fractures. His face was just completely broken up, and his tongue was hanging out the side of his face. And he kept saying, my arms hurt, my arms hurt. But his face was really what was getting me. And we couldn't transport him laying down unless we intubated him, because he couldn't control his airway because of all the blood and the fractures that were going on. So I said to the medic on the scene, I said, we need to give him a surgical airway, because we tried to hold his face together and bag him, and it wasn't working. We just couldn't get a seal on the mask. And I don't know where he got this scalpel from, but he whips it up and he says, I'm ready. It was like, we need more tools than that. So, but we managed to get a surgical airway in him, and it actually saved his life. So, those are good tools to have if you really need them. And you can do a surgical airway in 20 seconds once you practice. So the other training I think that's important message is if you're on a helicopter, you're considered crew by the FAA. And to be crew, you have to have certain training. And that means you know things about the aircraft, and you know rules, like they call them FARs, about what you can do in flight or not in flight. Can you have your phone on in flight? What's a sterile cockpit? When does that occur? And so there's lots of rules you need to learn. So we do quarterly training with that, and part of that is NVG training. And I was telling a couple of people before this started, NVGs are so cool because you can see amazing things with them. The military used them first, and they used to have an issue with them where if they got hit with a bright light, it destroyed the NVGs and you couldn't see at all. Those have been improved 100-fold, I think, because you can look at pretty much anything. The version that we have is a green. Everything looks green, but it's super bright and defined. And in the middle of the night, the moon is enough light to really light up your whole landing zone. They're moving to a white version, which is like daylight. I was like, that's amazing. But here's the cost. They're $40,000 each, and it takes 2 for every aircraft. So things are expensive in air medical. So, but they save people's lives. And the number one cause of crashes at night is flying into terrain because people couldn't see it. And when I think about where we used to fly up to Skycomish or Gold Bar at night. It is dark up there. And it was pitch black. And now that we have goggles, I'm thinking, what were we thinking to be flying in the dark up there? There's mountains on both sides of you, right? So we move forward for safety for a lot of reasons. We do safety training, and I don't have a picture of this, but we do a dunk tank like the Coast Guard. So we put people in a frame that has 2 helicopter seats in it, and we throw them in the pool. We have divers in there with us, but I can tell you that it's a freaky, freaky thing. And the last time we did the training, they put blindfolds on us because really, Puget Sound's dark, and you need to be able to feel your way out of that aircraft. So it's good training. It's scary training, and we don't force anybody to do it. We make them watch. We make them drill in the aircraft what they would do. But if they don't want to be tossed in the pool, we don't make them do that because we don't want to lose our flight nurses. And we just say, this is survival, right? If we have a crash in the water that's fairly controlled, you want to be able to get out of your aircraft. So yeah, it's one of the harder things about what we do. We do other winter and summer survival training. We're out there building forest fires and building shelters and spending the night into the shelter or whatever. But here's my one survival tip that we all carry now. Cotton balls saturated with Vaseline. That thing burns forever. So And of course, we use everything that's on the aircraft. The other thing we do for safety training is what we call safety stand-down, and that's we bring everybody in to talk about safety, and we bring people in to speak. So John Nance, I don't know if you guys know him, he was a pilot that's well known. He's a commentator on NBC News. He talks about anytime there's a crash or anything, you'll see John comment on it. Brought him in to talk about crew resource management. We brought in Captain Sullivan, they call him Sully. He's the one that brought the plane down in the Hudson after the birds went through it. And he talked about how he recognized who had what control on the plane and how they worked as a team and how they brought that aircraft down safely. And so we talk about bird strikes, which is what brought his plane down, and how we deal with those all the time. And there's a lot of big birds around here, and eagles think they're the king of the air, so they don't watch out for us. We have to watch out for them. So we've done a lot of training on that. Competency Days, we do those on for training for new equipment, like we replace a ventilator or we bring in the glide scope or whatever. We have 3 days actually of bringing all the crews in, and they get trained on that, and then they get checked off on that. We also do things like participate in studies. So if we're going to be in a study through the UW, we get all the information there and figure out how to get set up so that we can report off to that. So we're currently doing the TXA study for head injuries. And generally, Airlift brings in more patients than anybody else because we're coming from the rural areas. So we do that. We also do all the ALS courses, and that's all alphabet, but it's all, you know, it gets everybody thinking the same way. So ACLS, NRP, PALS, ATCN, which is the trauma nurse course based on ATLS, which is the one that we want all the docs to take so everybody thinks it's the same way. And that's an international program, ATLS is, which is good. And then we also send our nurses to clinical. Now, what you'll find in a lot of flight teams is they're hospital-based. They sit at the hospital, they help staff the ED, or they're the quick response team, or whatever it is, but they're there every day in the hospital, so they get lots of patient contact, they're maintaining their skills. Well, Airlift doesn't sit at a hospital anywhere. So one of the things we have to do is send people into clinical so they can stay current on what the therapies are, just to get some hands-on time with patients. I think our nurses average about 250 flights a year. So if you think about the volume of patients you see working in the ED, you could probably see 20 or 30 people in a shift versus us that are seeing 250 in a year. So you can see how you want to make sure that they stay in touch with what's going on. And so Harborview is really good. Seattle Children's is really good. We actually go to Children's OR over at Bellevue to get our intubations for pediatrics. And that is wonderful. They work very closely with us to do that. And then we're in the ED and ICUs at the other hospitals. And we actually come here to the U to work on the cardiac units. And we're trying to develop a balloon pump program with them, but it's had a little challenge getting off the ground. All right. Here's what happens when you call us. We have a 24-hour communication center staffed by 2 dispatchers. Most of these dispatchers have come from AMR or 911 centers prior to working with us, so they're good at knowing how to answer phones and get things moving. So they will gather some really brief information about the patient, where we're going to, and where they want us to return to. So, and then they'll page us. And so the pilot only gets information about where we're going and where we're coming back to. And the reason we do that is we don't want that pilot to make any emotional decisions about a patient. We don't want them to say, yes, we've got to do this because that's a 4-year-old kid and that's just like my kid. That is bad decision making. So we say to them, you just tell us if the flight's a go or a no-go, and we'll make a decision about the patient. So we're really careful about that. Now, once we're in the aircraft, we get a bigger patient report, and then they are going to hear about it. But they've already made a decision on whether the flight is safe or not. And we, as a team, are extra cautious, I'm going to say that. And I'm going to tell you, we've had 2 crashes, and we've learned from those crashes. So we have a rule that says 3 to go, 1 to say no. If one person says, there's something not right about this flight, then we step back and say, what's wrong? And if we can't fix that person's fears, then we say, fine, the flight's canceled. Because we know that if people had spoken up on either one of those 2 crashes, they wouldn't have happened. So, and that's a culture thing. So, and you'll see it nationwide in all air medical programs. That's a pretty standard mantra that they say. So once we get paged out, it takes us about 10 minutes to get off the ground. And that is because you don't just go out and fly a helicopter or a plane, right? It's not like driving your car out of the garage. You have to go through checklists. And the FAA says there are specific checklists you have to go through. And so the pilots are left in solitude to go through their checklist, especially if you're flying single pilot. He needs to make sure that he's done all the things. And it amazes me the number of buttons and tiles and switches that pilots have to do to get an aircraft off the ground. So once he's done with that, then we do our own checklists, because what we want to make sure is our equipment is secured, because you don't want to get injured if you hit turbulence because something's unsecured. And then you're no good to anybody. So one of the lessons we learned from one of our crashes are both engines on? And that might seem like a really kind of obvious thing, but there were some design changes in the helicopter that went from a pilot being very physical and pulling the engines on to 2 little switches. And that was a big motor, muscle memory change that actually we had a crash from. And so now that's part of our checklist, both engines. He says, yes, they're both on. So, so we learn from our experiences and we institute those into checklists. And I think as you guys go through your programs in medical school and then through residency, you'll find that checklists are a big deal. And those all come from aviation. So once we lift from wherever base we're at, our comm center calls that hospital or that scene or that 911 center and says, my bird's in the air, they'll be there in however many minutes, 17 minutes, 20 minutes, whatever. So they know how long they have to wait for us, because there's nothing more anxiety provoking than not knowing where your team is coming from and how long is it going to be, because it seems like forever. Sometimes it is. So once we arrive at the bedside, we talked a little bit about this, but one nurse takes report. Depending on what the age of the patient is or the condition of the patient, they decide. So on their way out, they've gotten the patient's age, weight, and what their condition is. So if you do a pediatric patient, we do a lot of asthma kids in the winter. So it may be a 10-year-old asthma kid requiring BiPAP currently on a continuous albuterol neb. So the plan is, we have an asthma scoring that we use. So we've gone through and we've scored based on the knowledge that we have, and we set up a plan. Most outlying facilities way underdose kids on albuterol, so we just have a plan. We're going to set them up. We're going to crank up their albuterol. We'll give them Atrovent, and if we have to, we'll start steroids on them. And then we'll look at what it's going to take to move them. And we rarely intubate an asthmatic. It happens on occasion, but rarely. So once we get there, one person takes report, the other person packages. And when I say package, we are moving in there, and what we do is we put them on our monitor. We put them pressure bags on our IV fluids because there's not enough room in the aircraft to run anything on gravity. And we put on pumps if they have any drips or pressors or anything like that going. And we're limited on what we can do. And that's one of our challenges is we bring 3 pumps with us. And if you walk into a room and there's 7 pumps, you got to figure out which ones are the important ones and which ones can, we'll put them on dial-a-flow or we'll take them off. We don't maintain any narcotic drips. Hospitals hate it when you take their narcotics. So they get bolus narcotics that way. So, so it's all about figuring it out. And then we do a quick assessment of the patient to see if things have changed since we got our report. And oftentimes things have changed. So once we do that, then we'll decide is there any other additional interventions we need. And if there's not, then we go and we wrap them up in we call it a burn wrap, but it's just a patient wrap that's polar fleece and waterproof, and to get them covered up. And then, because we're taking them out in the weather, and they always get cold. It doesn't matter what we do with them. In the middle of the summer is about the only time that we don't have cold patients. So if there's a hypothermia study out there, we want to be part of it. All right, once we load into our aircraft, and it takes us about 5 minutes to get the patient in the aircraft. And this is the interior of the EC-135, so you can see how cozy it is. They are definitely knee to knee in there. And that orange piece of equipment is a ventilator, and then the LifePak 15 sits right there. We protect the patient's hearing every time because it's noisy in there. And then the 3 pumps, you can't really, there's one right behind her head. They're tiny, they're about like this big. We can put anything we want on those, but we have 3 of them. We mount them there if we need to. And then the IVs, you can see where that's hanging from the ceiling and how close that is to the patient. So this was a stage picture, but that is pretty accurate about what we see with our patients. When you put an isolette in there, the poor adult nurse has it right at his knees, and there's not very much he can do except for manage the pumps. So once we load in the aircraft, we talk to our dispatch center and tell them we're lifting with the number of people on board. They track that. We're satellite tracked on our flight, and we're pinged every minute to watch where we're going. And then they give an ETA to the receiving facility so they can get ready for us. We operate a lot on protocols, and we don't give a lot of report to people, but for residency training, we call into Harborview and either talk to the Medic 1 doc or the trauma doc. And what we're doing is giving a patient report so they can hear what's going on and get ready. And at Harborview, we can call trauma codes if we need to, and those guidelines for that, pressure under 90. And they really get fired up when you tell them that you need a trauma code. Or if you have an airway issue, call an airway code. And it's an all hands on deck sort of event, because if we can't get an airway, then they know there's a big problem. So once we get there, we call a timeout, which you'll hear a lot of that, I'm sure, as you go through your program. And we want everybody to listen to what we're doing, right? We've lost airways, we've lost lines because people get into a frenzy. So we just say timeout, and that's pretty standard across the way. Everybody listens. We have them check breath sounds before we even move the patient, and we pull them over to the stretcher. And then the frenzy starts, depending on where you're at. We call it the blue wave at Harborview because there's so many people that can jump in on the patient. But once we give a report, we ditch out of there because we're just in the way. We can't do anything else. All right, so here's what we do. Neonatal care, that's an isolette that's sitting in the far corner there. It's covered up with a cover just to keep the warmth on. That's about 250 pounds for about a max of a 10-pound baby. It is a self-contained unit. It has pumps, monitor, ventilator. Some of them have 2 ventilators on them, one being an oscillating ventilator. We do nitric, which allows for some airway openings. It has pumps, and it also warms the baby. So I've had that isolette as hot as 37 or 38 degrees if I have a micro preemie in there, because they just lose so much heat through their skin. We attend high-risk deliveries, and that is, we've always offered that service because we have neonatal nurses on board. And if they say, oh, there's a mom coming at 28 weeks and we don't want to be by ourselves when we deliver, we say, we're on our way. We'll bring the isolette out there and we'll send a team out there that will help you resuscitate that baby. So often we get called. Our preference is to transport moms before delivery because there's nothing better than mom's uterus to keep that baby in and keep it better than we can do outside. So if they say, oh, she's 5, we say we'll take her because we can get her here or Swedish or down at Tacoma where they can give really good care to the baby. They have a full team there that knows what they're doing. That's the best option for a baby. Scene responses, we'll meet anywhere people want us to. Washington State Patrol is not really excited about us landing on the freeways. They hate it when things get shut down, even though we're on the ground for about 10 minutes when we land. So we're not really the biggest factor in the roads, but they see it as, for a long time, seen it like that. But this is a scene where there was a logger that was injured. They cut down all those trees for us to land, and they cut them really short because we have just moderate high struts, and so we can't land on anything that would damage the belly of the aircraft because then we can't fly. But so they were busy cutting things down while they had one person on standing there with the radio talking to us and telling us how the patient was doing. Loggers are a tough bunch, man. This guy crawled his way up to get a friend to help him, and he'd had horrible lower leg injuries. And so, but to get in, it was pretty rural up in Whatcom County. They cut down all those trees for us and brought us in, so that was fun. Flying ICU, and I say that because we do everything you can imagine. We've paced patients. We have started blood. We give pressors, whatever they need, epi, norepi. We do cardioversions, we do cardiac drugs, we do, the nitro. Chest pains are our easiest flight, right? They just, MONA, morphine, oxygen, nitrogen, nitroglycerin. So those are the easy ones. The hard ones are the cardiac shock. And I have a couple cardiac nurses that love getting those patients. I was like, have at it. They're a challenge, right? You manage kind of the whole pump thing, and they love that. But we do have all the medications that we need for that. We also used to be the only team that could transport somebody in cervical traction. Don't know how they developed it. It was this wire basket with this traction setup that you'd set the weight on. We used to help docs put traction, the tongs in people's heads, and then we'd transport them. And we actually almost did it for one of the ER docs at Harborview one time. He was out climbing and had a neck injury. But we don't use it anymore because nobody does that anymore. When's the last time you saw anybody in cervical traction? So it's gone the way of the dinosaur, I think, which is fine because we only did about 3 a year, and every time we got a call for that, it was like, oh, who does that one? So the other thing we have started doing is carrying blood because, again, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq have shown us that blood is very beneficial to patients. We can't carry whole blood in the U.S. They do that in Europe with good responses, but we carry 2 units of PAC cells and 2 units of FFP. And we have to warm it, of course, because nothing's worse than a cold trauma patient. We have a Buddy Light warmer, we call it, and it actually will warm to 37 degrees. So by the time it gets to the patient, it's warm when it goes in there. So TXA and blood is a big thing for us on trauma patients, and so we're carrying that everywhere we go. We use the iStat. I'm not sure if anybody's familiar with that. It's a little lab machine that we get to carry. We started carrying it for the babies, and it will do blood gases, electrolytes, glucose, lactates. That's the limit of what we do. We don't do H's and H's because we can't treat that, or we won't treat it because 2 units of blood oftentimes won't be enough if you really have an issue for blood. But we do make our ventilator changes based on our blood gases. So again, people are very good at drawing art sticks in really unusual positions. So you're never going to get an ideal kind of lay your arm out there on a towel roll and stick that radial artery. It just doesn't work in a helicopter. So, and they're very sensitive machines too. So they like their narrow temperature range. So oftentimes you'll see a nurse pulling one out of her flight suit because they have to keep it warm. You set it on the floor of the aircraft, like when you guys all fly commercial, your feet get cold because the aircraft's cold on the outside. The same with our iStats. We've had them go out of range. So we protect them. 2 to 8 degrees Celsius, that's the range for the iStat cartridges. All right, so what are our challenges of care? Small compartment. We are knee to knee. You have to be a good partner. It's a loud environment. We do hearing tests every year because we damage people's hearings being in the helicopter despite being in helmets. And then we have a limited capacity for extra stuff. So all our aircraft are limited by weight. We ask every crew member how much they weigh twice a year, and they have a limit that they can be. So they have a BMI of 27 or less is a requirement to fly with Airlift, and it's not fair to men. And every piece of equipment on that aircraft has been weighed and is part of the weight on the aircraft. So the patient's a minor detail really after you get all the other stuff weighed out. We have limited quantities of equipment and personnel. So again, small compartment, limited quantities. We can only fit 3 people in the helicopter plus 1 family member in addition to the patient. And sometimes, depending on the weight of the patient and the crew, we won't even take the family member because they're too heavy. So, and then we have to apologize. The Learjet doesn't have any limitations. The Pilatus and the Turbo Commander, the same. So you got 3 people in the helo, 4 people in the jet. Those are the active crew members. They're responsible for carrying and loading the patient and all the gear. So that picture up there has the crew with the bags on their back, and that's exactly how they carry it. And then the monitor usually sits on the stretcher, hanging off the stretcher. So you can see why we need to be efficient in what we're doing. And then finally, the limitations of weather. So again, it's not like pulling your car out in a stormy day and just saying you're going to drive slower down the road. Helicopters, unless they're big ones, don't de-ice, so you can't fly into any icing conditions. And if you can't see, there's rules about how far you can go, where you can take off and land. We need 200 feet up and half of my visibility out to land at an airport. So if we don't have that, and they report at airports, either by a little machine that just reads it every kind of 6 hours, or by a person in the tower, we can't take off. So there are those limitations of weather. And what you occasionally see is people will do helicopter shopping, they call it. And so we put on a website called Weather Turndown anytime we've turned down a flight. So the other helicopters for Life Flight Network and over in Eastern Washington, that they know we've turned down the flight. So if they get a call from the same people that says, hey, can you do this? They might be able to because they're coming from a different direction, or they'll say, no, weather's too bad, we can't do it, and we know that Airlift turned it down too. So we really want to stop people from trying to get somebody that will say yes, because that's how crashes happen, and it doesn't serve anybody. So there are times that we can't fly, period, even in our fixed-wing aircraft. And Southeast Alaska is kind of notorious for that in the winter, when they get just zero visibility, and nobody's taken off. Even Alaska Airlines, who has special approaches in there. So those are the challenges of flying. And that's sometimes hard for people to figure out, especially if you've never been up there. But nothing's scarier than being up in there, bumpy, ugly weather, under instrument flight rules, which means you can't see anything anyway, and hear the pilot say, oh, we're starting to ice. I'm like, we're turning around. So you have to learn how to, what are your risks? What are your acceptable risks? So helicopter flying and planes are safer than driving to work every day, but when they do have an accident, it's a big thing. So, all right, things to think about. And this is a little bit ahead of what you guys probably are doing, but anybody familiar with EMTALA? It's a federal law. It says that the referring physician has the responsibility and legal liability of moving the patient from their facility to the next one. They need to choose mode of transport, crew configuration, and they hold responsibility for that patient until they arrive at the referring hospital. A lot of physicians give up that. Don't know why, and they're like, get a transport team for me, and this unit secretary will call just whoever. But he's relinquishing some responsibility. So remember that. We say we bring you to medicine to the bedside, and we're comfortable with that, and we're here to help, but they have a legal responsibility for that. The other part of EMTALA is you can't ditch a patient without having an accepting physician or bed at another place. So we can't leave a facility until they say we've got accepting. So we'll go in and help. Safety, we talked a lot about safety and what that means. You want to make sure the program that you use in the future as an air medical has safety as one of their primary things. Our vision is to be the safest air medical company around. That's our vision. So it has nothing to do with patient care or anything. It's all just about safety. And if you can't be safe in the air, you shouldn't be moving patients. Our crew configuration, we mentioned that a little bit earlier. It's nurse medic is the most common one. You see that a lot when they do more scene type stuff. Nurse RT is another one, and you see those with specialty teams. Spokane had a flight team, Northwest MedStar, that until recently got taken over by Life Flight, was nurse RT. And again, they felt like that was a good thing. The RT handled all the airway stuff. And, ventilator, intubation, management of any airway illnesses, and then the nurses took care of the rest. And then airlift, and there's only a few teams like this out there, nurse. And the other thing you need to think about is time out of hospital. So what we hear a lot is, what's your ETA? How soon are you going to get to me? And that is important because, right, they've maxed out their resources. The other important thing is, how long are you going to be out of the hospital? So some teams will say they straight line fly. Other teams will do what it takes to get the flight, but then they'll fly around or do longer distances. So one example would be in Yakima, if the helicopter was there and they wanted the helicopter to take the flight, but there was icing conditions, one of the things you can do is fly down and around in the gorge, so go down to the Columbia River and back up. But that's a long flight in a helicopter, where if you put them in a plane, you're 30 minutes across the mountains. So it's, you think about that. And specialty needs. So we put on specialty team members if we do balloon pumps, mobile ECMO, EMTALA pumps, which is another sort of bypass assistance. So we need to think about that. Are there people on there that have skills that we need to add on, and which we'll do? And then finally, I don't know if you guys have time to watch the news, but the biggest deal right now in air medicine nationally, and this has reached Congress, this has reached state legislatures, is the cost of air ambulance. So the same as in medicine everywhere, you bill your costs and hope that insurance pays a percentage of it. You know what Medicare and Medicaid pay for, and it's not nearly what it is needs to cover your costs. And then there are people that you have to give charity care to. But these costs have been ramping up, especially since the Airline Deregulation Act, as more and more people have gotten into this kind of business. There are people that are in it for profit, and then there's other people that are hospital-based or not for profit. And so everybody has kind of their plan they need to do. But I'll give you an example. Airlift flies from Juneau to Seattle regularly. When I first started at Airlift, it was about a $50,000 flight, so still expensive. Insurance covered a lot of it. Now it's $100,000. So if you tell a patient in the worst day of their life they're going to have to spend $100,000 to move their loved one, they take a big gasp and say, oh my God, what am I going to do? We don't put anybody into bankruptcy, right? That's not what we're here for. We're here for the patient. But that's something that's caught the attention of everybody. So you need to think about, what's the best mode of transport? And the costs are all over the place. We're right in the middle, and we try and stay that way. So you'll hear about that. If you're going to transfer a patient, sometimes it's like, how much is this going to cost me? It's not, well, it's going to save my life. You have to balance that. So here's why we fly. It's an opportunity to impact a family. Every single day, I make a difference in somebody's life. And that's really why airlift nurses are there. And every single one of them will tell you, I'm here for the mission. And that's to move patients to the next level of care and make an impact on somebody's life. We do get to see the world. And these aren't great pictures on the slide, but that's Mount Rainier up there on the mountainous one. We see gorgeous sunsets. I've seen Alaska so much. I told my mother-in-law I'd never go on a cruise up there. Gorgeous glaciers, but I mean, you have an opportunity, right, to see things. You see how people do things. You get to see new families, new places. And then it's a great environment to work in. And I was telling somebody before, nobody leaves Airlift. I have 30-year employees there. I've had somebody that retired out of there at 32. And Airlift celebrates 35 years next fall. So people stay, and they stay for the mission, and they stay because of the independence they have as nurses. And it's not what you get in the hospital. So we're here to support you and your patient, and that's what we tell people. This is the 30-year anniversary picture, and I actually cut off a few people, but it's a big group. We're about 150 people between admin, pilots, mechanics, nurses, and dispatchers. So, and we work closely with the transfer center at UW Medicine to help bring patients into the hospital. But we're also Switzerland. We take patients anywhere. I've taken Swedish, VM, Prov Everett's a big one, all the Tacoma hospitals. We will go anywhere, and we've always been like that. So some hospital-based programs will only go to their hospital. We go everywhere. So that's why we do fly. I took a baby to CHOP a couple weeks ago, which is Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh. So whatever people need from us, we'll do. All right, any questions? This is on the roof of Prov Everett, actually. Yep. Mm-hmm. So we staff our crews 24-hour shifts. So in the morning they come in, they take pagers and phones from the previous day's crew. They check their aircraft, and then essentially they're on standby until the pager goes off. So in the summer, we average anywhere between 15 and 20 flights a day for the whole program. So a lot busier than people think. And in the winter, it can be 2 or 3 flights for the whole program. So we average about 3,500 flights a year. In 2000, we were at 5,000 flights a year, so you can imagine we were pretty busy. A variety of reasons why we dropped off with the recession. And so people don't spend money foolishly or do high-risk activities when they don't have extra money. But in the summer, everybody seems to find a little bit of extra money, and off they go on their vacations and do all kinds of crazy things. So yeah, essentially we have training that they need to do online. They have equipment checks they need to do every day. I have them do quality tests on the ISTAT, and then they bring things to do because nothing will give you a headache faster than waiting for your pager to go off. So they stay busy, and we have tons of committees they need to participate on, a clinical practice committee, a safety committee, a standards group. So they all have things they need to do. And then if they're really bored, we'll have them do quality on their charts. So everybody has to do some quality stuff. So, but 24-hour shifts. So these nurses, and that's the other reason they don't leave. So we do a 6-week schedule. They work 9 shifts in 6 weeks. That's a full-time shift for nurses. So it is really, it's not what I do, but it's what a lot of the nurses are doing. So it's a great schedule. Think about raising your kids. 9 shifts in 6 weeks. It's beautiful. So I gave a link here. That's our observer program. If you are interested in coming along for a day, I'm glad to have you. I have my business card down there. If you want to just send me an email, I'll send you the link. It's a form to fill out. It has a few questions. We try and gather a little bit of information from the people that ride with us. Our focus definitely is on our EM residents and fellows that fly with us, and also EMS that we interact with, because what we find is people don't really know what we do, or why does it take so long for you to get off the ground? You know, and there's nothing more challenging to watch for a medic to see us spinning and not understand why we aren't lifting. And so we put them in the aircraft so they can watch the process. So, but we have nursing students that come through, so certainly if you guys are interested in a ride along, we'll make a day for you. So here's the requirements of a ride along. We'll give you a flight suit so you can look all shiny like us and glow in the dark. I often joke, nobody will run over my legs. And bring a computer or something to keep yourself busy, bring food, bring pocket money just in case we have to abandon you, which is not unheard of. I had a poor resident, I left 2 different places one day. She managed to get herself back from Grace Harbor and Bremerton. So she was we try not to leave you behind, but on those occasions that we have, because we'll screen the flights first. But we do want people to come and know what it's like to work in those small quarters and figure out how to function with just 2 of you, because it's not like you get to call the Blue Wave in and everybody gets to help you. It's you and your partner running a code, or you and your partner resuscitating somebody that needs fluid and blood and all kinds of things, so an intubation. So it's a different kind of dynamic to work with 2 people. So come and see that. As EM physicians, well, I'll just tell you the story. When I worked in Montana, I rode the ambulance, and that was, I'm going to date myself, before they had paramedics and just EMTs in Montana. So we were the first nurse car to go out to scenes. And so unfortunately, one of our EMTs had a cardiac arrest in the bathroom of the crew quarters. So we're being paged out for transport. We got out there, we found this guy, we called a code, our ER doctor came running out, and the first thing he said was, how do you guys work like this? You know, we're in a small bathroom and there's 4 of us around this guy trying to do CPR. And I said, this is what we work in all the time. You know, you don't get to call in all the fancy help and whatever, you use the resources that you have. So be MacGyver, understand that nurses are doing the best they can out there, or the medics, if you're working with the nurse medic program. They are very creative in getting things done. So, any questions? So, right, so those are referral patterns. So what we take into Prov Everett are premature babies and cardiac, and they are a level 2 trauma system. So they are starting to want to get more patients in that qualify, that they should be able to take care of. So one of the things we saw was with the shootings at Marysville, and that was a whole other fiasco for us, but they said they could take all those kids into, and you know, they all had life-ending injuries, unfortunately, except for the one that survived. What they very quickly found out is what their resource capability was. You know, how many neurosurgeons do they have? How much blood do they have? Do they have the staff to care for that many critically injured people? So they had great lessons they learned from that, but they also have said, we want to do this. So now we're going to start taking trauma into Prov Everett. And they are fully qualified to do it. They have all the specialties there. But so when you do a scene, we don't make the decision. The medics make the decision. So we say to the medic, where do you want this patient to go? And if they say, oh, I don't really know, then the standard is in the state that you take them to the highest level of care you can get them in 30 minutes. So for a lot of people, that ends up being Harborview, right? The other things that we see are referrals for cardiac care. So Prov Everett does cardiac care. Swedish is a great one for cardiac. BM does a ton of cardiac and medical ICU. So it's referral patterns between physicians. So what you'll see is if they grew up in this program with UW residency, they know the system, they're really comfortable in doing that. If they have limited resources, and like Harborview does a ton of neck fash and pelvic injuries and burns. We bring a lot of that to them because that's what they're really good at. Coma is starting to be their own level 2 trauma system too. And this is not something that you find in every state. It would be ideal, but you don't. So you take it to where the resources are. So sometimes that's a little bit hard to figure out. Now, I know Seattle Children's is on what they call high census, which means they don't have any ICU beds. So where do they go? We took a kid over to Mary Bridge the other day from Seattle Children's because they didn't have any ICU beds for him. So there's some of that too that goes on. So physician to physician referral, capacity of the hospital, and then what the scene providers want. Sure.